Oh, fine. I guess I'm at your beck.
Add call.
No!
Today, when we think of quality animated shows, Fox hardly enters the picture. But this wasn't the case until a few years ago, and Fox pretty much dominated the scene. From Spider-Man and Batman to stuff like The Simpsons, Beetlejuice, and Extreme Ghostbusters, Fox produced everything. And although some of the awesome Fox animated series have been forgotten, many of them have stood the test of time. In this video, we're going to explore the 20 best Fox animated series of all time, but before we begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. And now, let's begin. Spider-Man, the animated series. 1994 to 97. The 94 Spider-Man animated series pretty much rehashed the usual spider bite in a lab origin for our friendly neighborhood superhero. The title sequence took care of that, where they show a quick spider bite and a guitar riff courtesy of Aerosmith's Joe Perry, and then it was straight into the web slinging. The show started with Peter Parker struggling between college classes at Empire State University, taking care of Aunt May, getting yelled at by J. Jonah Jameson, and trying to keep his love life from falling apart. Alicia Hardy and Mary Jane Watson both had his attention, while his best friend Harry Osborn quietly simmered with the kind of tension that only the Osborn family can bring. Each episode threw Peter into conflict with villains that felt pulled from every corner of Marvel's rogues gallery. You had science experiments gone sideways like Doc Ock and the Green Goblin, underworld players like Kingpin and Hobgoblin, and alien nightmares in the form of Venom and Carnage. Occasionally, some big names would swing through. We're talking about characters like the XMen, Daredevil, Blade, and even Doctor Strange for that matter. Now, this gave the show a real connected universe energy long before the MCU made that the norm. Interestingly, the first season became a tour of villain origin stories, but once the show moved into multi-part arcs, things really picked up. One of the best arcs has to be the Venom Saga, which was a 3-part story that did more with the symbiote in 60 minutes than most movies have managed in 2 hours. Yep, that includes Spider-Man 3 as well as the 2018 Venom movie, at least in our books. Despite all those TV censors that the show received, it pretty much managed to sidestep these restrictions without breaking a sweat. Since no real guns were allowed, laser blasters replaced bullets, and Spider-Man drop-kicked more goons than you'd expect for a hero who technically wasn't allowed to punch anyone. Strangely enough, the limitations gave the show its own vibe, and credit where it's due. You see, the voice cast carried half the weight of the show. Christopher Daniel Barnes made Peter sound earnest and made Spidey sound like he actually enjoyed cracking skulls and wisecracks in equal measure. Edward Asner nailed Jameson before J.K. Simmons ever touched a cigar, and then there's Roscoe Lee Brown, who brought the gravitas needed for Kingpin. Oh, and did you know that Mark Hamill voiced Hobgoblin? That's right, he does an amazing job too. Batman, the animated series. 1992 to 95. Batman, the animated series, dropped with a bang in 92, but not in the way Saturday morning cartoons usually do. It wasn't about flashy, bright colors or jokes every 5 seconds. The show stood the test of time, and now, because of one reason and one reason alone, it became larger than life. It gave us a brooding Gotham drenched in shadows, led by a Batman who wasn't there to hold your hand. Far from the campy Adam West version or the safe, smiling Batman from Super Friends, the Batman from the animated series was the real thing, in that he was a scarred, haunted hero who was almost always walking a line between justice and obsession. At the center was Bruce Wayne, sure, but the real magic was how the show treated everyone else. Criminals weren't just evil for the sake of it. More often than not, they were broken, bitter, or clinging to some piece of their past. A scientist trying to force love, an aging actress trying to freeze time, a man turned into a monster because of grief. The series pulled from iconic comic arcs like The Laughing Fish and Two-Face, while also creating original tales that hit harder than they had any right to, especially for a quote-unquote kids show. For instance, Heart of Ice turned Mr. Freeze from a joke into a tragedy. Ra's al Ghul, which roughly translates to King of Ghouls, became a legend in his own right as the villain with unclear morals. Of course, the Joker, played by Mark Hamill, was both terrifying and cunning, but somehow he managed not to go off the rails. And what Kevin Conroy did when it came to playing Batman and Bruce Wayne will never be forgotten. Visually, the show didn't have the glossy, hypermodern look which was a staple to shows back then. Instead, Gotham felt frozen in time thanks to those rotary phones, blimps in the sky, and Art Deco towers stabbing into the clouds. They called it Dark Deco, and somehow it worked. The city looked like it came out of a pulp magazine, but Batman still used lasers and computers. We believe that Batman the Animated Series is what it is today because it treated its audience like they had a mind and never talked down or over-explained. The Simpsons, 1989. When The Simpsons first appeared as a few scrappy shorts on The Tracy Ullman Show back in 1987, nobody expected it to evolve into a pop culture monolith that would survive more than 35 years. But by the time the Christmas special aired in '89, the full series launched, something had changed. The animation was now tighter, the voices better locked in, and suddenly, Springfield felt like a real place, just one where the laws of physics didn't always apply. At the center of it all was a yellow, four-fingered family trying to stay sane in Middle America. Homer, somehow in charge of nuclear safety, couldn't spell nuclear, while Marge held things together with little more than her hair and stubborn patience. Bart was chaos with a slingshot, and Lisa read too much and worried even more. Maggie, the baby, didn't speak but watched everything, and under all the jokes and slapsticks, the show quietly built a family that, for all its dysfunction, stuck together when it really counted. Once the show hit its stride in season 2, the writing really, and we mean really, took off. Every episode had multiple layers. The main story usually held up fine on its own, but if you look closer, there were sight gags, movie nods, and one-liners beautifully tucked away in the background, and none of these references or anecdotes felt forced. Eventually, the balance between sharp writing and visual jokes became the show's USP. For movie nerds and culture junkies, it was a treasure trove. Now, the tone was something that always shifted from bizarre to more bizarre. One week, Homer might take on a corrupt corporation, the next he'd fight George Bush in his own backyard. Sometimes he went to space, sometimes he had a deep, painful conversation with Lisa about growing up. The interesting thing is that this lack of distinction between the surreal and the grounded actually made both feel more real. I don't think we need to convince you that The Simpsons is a pop culture juggernaut, and you should check it out if you haven't, especially seasons 2 through 9. X-Men, the animated series, 1992 to 96. Much like Batman the Animated Series, X-Men the Animated Series didn't treat its audience like it was made up of kids with short attention spans. It opened with a team from Jim Lee's early 90s X-Men comics, and we had everyone from Cyclops, Wolverine, Rogue, and Storm to Beast, Gambit, Jean Grey, Jubilee, and of course, Professor X. Not just these characters either, we also got a few originals, like Morph, who was loosely based on the comic character Changeling. And the most amazing part was that instead of being random standalone episodes, the show strived to serialize the storytelling. Although you could start watching in between seasons, you'd get the most out of the story and make sense of everything if you followed it from the beginning. Most arcs were built on what came before, and a few even dared to let their consequences carry into later seasons. The first season was pretty much about Sentinels, anti-mutant conspiracies, Magneto's ideology, and Apocalypse trying to force evolution by fire. That season also had a mutant assassination plot, Beast's jail time, and Morph's apparent death. And the writers didn't stop there. Season 2 raised the stakes with Mr. Sinister, Cyclops, and Jean's rather adventurous honeymoon, plague conspiracy thanks to Apocalypse to pit humans against mutants. Between episodes, you'd get flashbacks, dream sequences, cameos, even philosophical detours through the Savage Land, and somehow it all worked. As for the crossovers, they were few but memorable. Spider-Man swung through one time, seeking help with his mutation, and on his show, the Secret Wars arc didn't bring the full X-Men team, but Storm did make the cut, mostly because her voice actor happened to live in LA where Spider-Man was recorded. We agree that a few of the arcs were a bit messed up because of the time travel and all that, but even when it bent logic, the show stayed emotionally grounded. Beetlejuice, 1989. Beetlejuice, the animated series, didn't care a lot about the live-action film. Instead of a sleazy bio-exorcist trying to marry a teenager, we got a mischievous ghost with a thing for causing all sorts of trouble and leaving a trail of chaos in his wake. Of course, there was this weirdly wholesome friendship with a goth girl named Lydia. The show barely acknowledged the plot of the movie, and that actually worked in the series' favor. What it did adopt from the movie was the spirit, the bizarre netherworld, the same manic energy, and the unapologetically odd tone that could only have come from Tim Burton. I mean, just look at stuff like Edward Scissorhands. The man has a different way of thinking than most of us. Beetlejuice in the show isn't evil. He's more like that friend who can't stay out of trouble but means well half the time. He scams his way through the afterlife, comes up with faulty schemes for fame or fortune, and somehow never gets kicked out of the netherworld. In the cartoon, he's annoying, selfish, and extremely unpredictable, but there's something about him that pulls you in. You can't entirely trust him, but you'd still invite him to a party, even if it meant someone might end up turned into a banana. Then there's Lydia, clever, introverted, and a little bit morbid girl. She doesn't quite fit into the world of the living, and Beetlejuice doesn't fit into the world of the dead, so naturally, they make a great pair. She anchors the madness, brings the heart, and reminds you that even in a haunted sandbox of monsters and undead bureaucrats, it's okay to be different. As far as the animation is concerned, they never tried to do anything grand with it, and always preferred texture to polish. For a show spun off from a movie, it could have been lazy, but Beetlejuice brought actual energy and imagination to the table. Futurama, 1999. Futurama is set in the 31st century, where New York is stacked on the bones of the old New York, and mutants live in the ruins below, so it's bound to give you some Judge Dredd vibes, but without all the darkness. The show leans into sci-fi cliches with a smile, which gives you a future where religion blends into the first amalgamated church, the internet runs on pop-ups and porn, and the most terrifying holiday figure is a murderous robot Santa. Hover cars have replaced wheels, alcohol fuels robots, and anchovies have been extinct for centuries thanks to decapodians. It's absurd, but there's a system to the madness, truly. Created by Matt Groening, Futurama was always going to suffer from comparisons to The Simpsons. And while it never quite matched the cultural juggernaut status of its predecessor, it did carve out its own niche and is one of the shows from the 90s that still remains relevant. Where The Simpsons poked at suburbia, Futurama lobbed grenades at bureaucracy, climate collapse, and pop culture. All of this was filtered through a sci-fi lens that gave the writers room to get weird, fast, and often smart. The core cast is composed of Fry, Leela, Bender, and a rotating orbit of oddballs who keep things steady. Their emotional arcs didn't always land with force, but the show never promised depth to begin with. It promised comedy with jetpacks and talking heads in jars, and that's definitely delivered. Fry remains the last man to understand the wheel, Bender treats petty theft as a personality trait, and Zoidberg begs for dignity like a crustacean version of Job. Visually, the mix of traditional animation and early digital effects gave it an identity. The backgrounds often did more world-building than the dialogue. Supporting characters from the robot devil to Morbo the news anchor monster fill in the cracks, and instead of overstaying, they add to the texture. Yes, some episodes lean too far into nonsense, but even when the plot failed, the show, overall, is a clever one. Also, if you want to cry, check out the episode Jurassic Bark. Don't say we didn't warn you. Tiny Toon Adventures, 1990. Tiny Toon Adventures was released in 1990 with the singular agenda of passing the cartoon torch to something entirely new without losing the essence. Set in Acme Acres, where mayhem and mishaps are pretty much the norm, the show followed a younger generation of Looney Tunes. Bugs, Daffy, Porky, and the rest of the old guard were professors at Acme University, where they handed out gags instead of grades. Hey, speaking of old guard, did you check out the second old guard movie? When we were making this video, we didn't quite get the time to watch it, so yeah, let us know how it is. Anyways, coming back to Tiny Toons, Buster and Babs Bunny, no relation, led the pack, with Plucky Duck scheming his way through class, Hampton J. Pig cleaning up after everyone, and Elmira and Montana Max making sure that no episode ever stayed quiet for too long. There was plenty of anvil-dropping nonsense, but tucked between the gags were satirical jabs at Hollywood, politics, and pop culture. Some references flew right over kids' heads and landed years later when you caught a rerun and finally got the joke. And while the episodes didn't always take place in class, the show never wandered far from the spirit of its own setup. Comedy is something you learn, refine, throw wildly at the screen. Visually, it had bright backgrounds, clean animation, and a theme song that burrowed into your head after one listen. For a spin-off, Tiny Toon Adventures didn't coast on nostalgia, it respected the legacy but made its own rules, in that it was loud, fast, and full of energy. Not every series aimed at kids managed to be this smart, self-aware, and chaotic in the best way possible, so yeah, if you ask us, Tiny Toons definitely deserves every bit of its Saturday morning run. King of the Hill, 1997 to 2025. King of the Hill never tried to compete with the louder animated shows on TV. It didn't chase cutaways, slapstick, or outlandish premises. Instead, it was set in Arlen, Texas, with Hank Hill and his propane-fueled sense of order, and the series told stories that felt oddly grounded for a cartoon. So yeah, Frank sold propane and propane accessories. He drank beer with his friends by the fence in their back alley, and he struggled to understand his son, tolerated his niece, and kept his composure while everything around him gradually drifted into absurdity. You see, Hank is a cool guy. Be like Hank. Now, the show played its comedy in a really simplistic manner. Peggy, who was almost always overconfident and underqualified, somehow ended up in every possible profession. I mean, her job profile ranged from substitute Spanish teacher, columnist, and notary, to even a softball pitcher and a real estate agent. She's not really good at any of it, kind of like the Johnny Sins of cartoons, albeit without any of the adult movie making. Well, almost none of the adult movie, but we're not here to talk about that today. On the other hand, we have their son, Bobby Hill, who shows no interest in sports or masculinity and leans instead towards comedy and culinary skills, which pretty much irritates his dad but wins our hearts. Luann was the chaotic and sweet one and eventually married Lucky, who cashed out on a slip-and-fall lawsuit and treated it like a career. So you see, all of this is pretty grounded and believable, as if it's the cast of a daily soap or a sitcom. King of the Hill never really aimed for any grand or over-the-top dramatic moments, but it earned its quietness. The writing, as well, didn't scream for attention. It observed, let the silence sit, and let the characters reveal themselves over time. In all honesty, Arlen feels very real, even if you never wanted to live there. That's what made it last, and why, long after it ended, it still doesn't feel dated. King of the Hill is set for a revival this year, and honestly, we're pretty excited about it. Animaniacs, 1993 to 97. Animaniacs was another unique show, and it was set in a world where logic came second to nearly everything else, where Shakespeare would get roasted in one segment and a burping contest would be commended for being awesome. Set at the Warner Bros. Studio lot in Burbank, California, the series introduced the Warner brothers, Yakko, Wacko, and the Warner sister Dot. These were basically three black and white agents of cartoon bedlam who were sealed in the Warner Bros. Water tower since the 1930s, and one day they were, unleashed on a modern world that they barely understood but had no trouble mocking. The siblings weren't limited by time or place, and their sketches bounced across eras, continents, and genres. And these would deal with every subject under the sun: pop culture, history, and Hollywood. Each episode shuffled together 2 or 3 shorts, sometimes built around the Warners, sometimes around side characters with their own flavor of madness. It worked more like sketch comedy than a traditional series, and that flexibility allowed the writers to go anywhere, from parodies of film and literature to send-ups of celebrity culture, and even moments of musical brilliance like the Nations of the World song that's been stuck in everyone's head for decades. Seriously, you should check it out on YouTube. At its best, Animaniacs balanced highbrow references with total absurdity, and even when it dipped into bathroom humor or simpler gags, it never lost its rhythm. The Tick, 1994 to 96. After passing his tryouts at the National Super Institute in Reno, the Tick is assigned to a place known only as the City. Villains are ridiculous, justice is loud, and nothing really makes much sense. There, he joins hands with Arth, a former accountant in a moth suit, who slowly goes from reluctant sidekick to the show's emotional center. Together, they take on lunatics like Chairface Chippendale, Breadmaster, Alcide, and a villain literally named the Terror. What makes The Tick different from every other superhero spoof is that it actually cares about being a good show. Now, although the absurdity is pretty much baked into the world, it's never used as an excuse to skip on storytelling. Ben Edlund, who created the character back in 1986 for a comic store newsletter, knew the difference between parody and laziness. He filled the show with strange, exaggerated characters, sure, but gave them enough internal logic to make it all hold together. In fact, the Tick himself is a sincere, deeply confused superhero who talks to furniture and punches evil in the face with genuine enthusiasm. Although Fox Kids wanted to target younger audiences with the show, the writing never lost its intelligence and charm, so much so that you and I could revisit it and still have fun. It's honestly hilarious. Later episodes even aired on Comedy Central after Fox gave up on producing new ones. Still, the show's cult following is what makes The Tick win as a cartoon. Bobby's World, 1990. Bobby's World debuted in 1990, back when Howie Mandel still had hair and Fox Kids was at its peak. The series ran for 8 seasons, and while it never tried to revolutionize television, quietly built a reputation as one of the more thoughtful, kid-friendly cartoons of the decade. Each episode opened with Mandel himself in a live-action intro beside an animated Bobby, then transitioned into a full cartoon where Howie voiced Bobby's father. The show's format was always the same, in which Bobby, a wide-eyed kid with a vivid imagination, would face a minor crisis, blow it out of proportion in his head, and work through it with the help of family. The best part was that a lesson was tucked somewhere inside along the way, which pretty much makes each episode a fable. The first episode, The Visit to Aunt Ruth's, Bobby dreads a trip to see a relative he barely remembers. By the end, he enjoys it more than expected, and if you think about it, it's pretty relatable. I mean, how many times have you dreaded a particular gathering or event, but actually had fun once you got there? The morals in Bobby's World were never loud or preachy, almost always pretty easy to find if you were paying a bit of attention. We particularly enjoyed Bobby's voice and how he said the things he did. His take on the world felt honest in the sense that he often misheard adult phrases, misread intentions, and spun entire daydreams around the ordinary. The puns helped too. At the end of most episodes, Howie reappeared in a hybrid live-action and cartoon segment to chat with Bobby and to talk directly to the audience, thereby breaking the fourth wall without breaking the tone. Tasmania, 1991. Built around the Tasmanian Devil, yep, the adorable and frightful one, This show was set in a yellow-skied version of Tasmania, which was filled with oddball neighbors, tourist traps, a family that made Taz look almost normal. Taz still grunted, span, and ate everything in sight, but this version of him also had a job, and as strange as it may sound, it's true. So what's Taz's job profile? Well, he worked as a bellhop at the Hotel Tasmania. Of course, the guests here were usually more unhinged than he was. Taz's family would fill in the narrative gaps his grunts couldn't. Let me explain. Hugh, the father of the family, spent most of his time rambling through golf metaphors and orange juice monologues in a Bing Crosby lilt. Molly, the teenage sister, had enough sarcasm to counterbalance her brothers. Jake, the youngest, looked up to Taz like he was a rock star, and when all of these characters came together, they gave the show a proper homely feel, a place where the 90s cartoon comedy collided with sitcom-style family bits. We want to commend the writer for how smart they dealt with the show. Taz didn't suddenly turn into a philosopher or start talking like Daffy, right? I mean, he spoke when needed, but stayed mostly true to form. The cast around him did the heavy lifting in terms of dialogue and plot. Supporting characters like Bushwhacker Bob, Francis X, Bushlad, and the Kiwi were the ones who were usually the cause of all the trouble. And as for the Hotel Tasmania itself, it basically served as an excuse to bring in new guests and new problems every episode. Having said that, Tasmania didn't make a huge cultural impact, but it did what most spin-offs fail to do. It made a one-joke character interesting for more than 5 minutes. And honestly, for a cartoon that was built on grunts and gibberish, that's not bad at all. Iron Man, 1994 to 96. The first season of Iron Man had all the ingredients of a big superhero series. I mean, it had great villains galore, a tech-savvy hero, and a whole roster of side characters. But in hindsight, it kind of feels like a missed opportunity. The animation felt stiff, the writing rarely got past surface level, and most of the supporting cast barely got more than a name and a power. Tony Stark, along with War Machine, Scarlet Witch, Hawkeye, Sentry, and Spider-Woman, bought a rotating lineup of Mandarin's cronies, including MODOK, Dread Knight, Hypnodia, and even Fing Fang Fu. There were lasers, explosions, and evil plans, but not much else. The show saved Tony's origin story for a later episode, which now feels like a band-aid rather than a fix. Then came the second season, which felt like someone had finally read the comics. There was a new animation studio and new head writer, which basically brought in a much-needed new energy. Mandarin faded into the background after losing his rings, and Tony Stark was now in full focus. His armor evolved, and he could now change suits while still on a mission. Additionally, they made the tone slightly darker, and the story gained actual momentum. The writing improved substantially, and for once, Iron Man felt like more than just a guy in a shiny suit. Unfortunately, the show ended after the second season. Silver Surfer, 1998. Silver Surfer, the animated series, came and went in 1998, but it left behind something stranger and more ambitious than most of the Marvel IPs at the time. It borrowed the sweeping aesthetic of Jack Kirby, with its cosmic swirls and blocky tech. It was also great because it brought together traditional cell animation with digital elements. The show looked like a Silver Age comic book brought to life, but it moved like it was stuck in molasses, and that's because the way the animation was done hasn't really aged well. We'll tell you the practical problem here. Although the visuals aimed for high quality, the budget clearly didn't keep up. The story cut out the Fantastic Four entirely and focused instead on Nor and Rad, whose fractured memories start to resurface after an encounter with Thanos. This change in tone gave the show a more introspective feel. The Surfer doesn't protect Earth because of a moral obligation to Reed Richards or the usual hero nonsense. He protects it because it reminds him of his home, Zen Law, a peaceful planet that he gave up his humanity to save. The show doesn't rush to paint him as a savior, and he spends much of it wandering, doubting, and sometimes remembering. Thanos, Adam Warlock, Ego the Living Planet, and Pip the Troll are a few of the villains who appear, but not like they do in the comics. Warlock is reimagined as a Kree-fighting super soldier. Thanos, stripped of his obsession with death due to broadcast restrictions, now serves Lady Chaos. It's not quite canon, but it fits the show's bent logic. Unfortunately, only one season made it to air. 8 more episodes were written but never produced, thanks to a rights dispute between Marvel and Saban. And honestly, that's a shame. The series was flawed, sure. It even had uneven animation, clunky dialogue, and characters who sometimes felt like rough drafts of their comic versions, but there was some real thought that went behind it. It deserved a second chance. Of all of Marvel's animated 90s TV shows, this one was the most philosophical and soulful. Bob's Burgers, 2011. Bob's Burgers doesn't rely on punchlines or pop culture crutches. Set in a corner of Seymour's Bay and inside a fading green building between a crematorium and whatever joke storefront the episode chooses to show, Bob's Burgers, more often than not, lets the Belchers do their thing. Bob Belcher flips burgers, mutters under his breath, and deals with customers who often feel more like extended family than revenue streams. Linda handles life with wine, song, and a relentless optimism that somehow hasn't been crushed by the slow death of small business. Teddy lives nearby and is devoted and lonely, while Mort shows up for food and existential dread. Then there's the Belcher kids. Tina writes zombie horse fanfiction and stumbles through puberty with the confidence of a deer on ice. Jean lives in a permanent soundscape of keyboard effects and bodily noises. Louise runs psychological operations out of the back of the restaurant with a pink bunny hat and no mercy. Together, they make the show breathe by simply being offbeat, loud, and strangely grounded. Episodes tend to orbit the restaurant but aren't really bound to it in chains, and they do explore other stuff with relative ease. Sometimes the whole family ends up solving a local mystery, or they rescue a mechanical shark, or participate in an underground table-setting competition. And yet, it never feels like a stretch. The town itself is built to absorb that kind of whiz. They've got places like Jimmy Pesto's smug pizza place across the street, then there's the bureaucracy of Wagstaff School, a rotating cast of oddballs who pass through the neighborhood. What brings it all together is the writing, which is far from flashy or desperate for attention, just funny in a way that doesn't need to announce itself. The voice acting by H. John Benjamin, Kirsten Schall, and Eugene Merman really steals the show. It all works because it's sincere. You see, these aren't sitcom archetypes shoved into animation. In fact, they feel like people who happen to live in a cartoon. The Magic School Bus, 1994. Premiering in 1994, this show turns science class into a Saturday morning acid trip with Miss Frizzle at the wheel, who was voiced by Lily Tomlin, the kind of gleeful chaos usually reserved for mad scientists or stage musicians. The show adapted Joanna Cole and Bruce Deegan's educational book series into animated form without losing its oddball energy. It ran for 4 seasons and somehow convinced a generation of kids that diving into a human bloodstream was a perfectly normal field trip. Walkerville Elementary served as a home base, but most of the action happened outside the classroom. One episode had the class travel through a digestive tract. Another explored a fever from the inside of Ralphie's bloodstream. A third followed the students as they examined bones and muscles, which naturally ended with a student building a life-sized robot. The show used proper scientific terminology like esophagus, bacteria, photosynthesis, and neurons, and trusted the visuals to do the rest. Sometimes it got unexpectedly graphic for its target age group. Not grotesque, but definitely enough to make a few parents squint while their kids cheered at animated mucus and muscle fibers. And that's just part of its legacy. The Magic School Bus never sanitized its subject matter. SpiderMan Unlimited. This version of Spider-Man was set on an Earth hiding behind the sun, which was overrun by animal hybrids and authoritarian robots. The show pitched itself as something new, a familiar character in an unfamiliar world, but that gamble never quite landed, mostly because no one knew what to make of it. The show opens with Spider-Man trying to stop Venom and Carnage from boarding a space shuttle headed to counter Earth. When the mission fails and the world loses contact with John Jameson, Spidey takes the blame, gets publicly vilified, and ends up borrowing tech from Reed Richards to build himself a new suit. The suit comes with stealth, sonic defenses, upgraded web shooters, basically a prototype for what the MCU would give him almost 2 decades later. Fury on his tail and no backup, Spider-Man hijacks the shuttle and forces Jameson to a planet that's more dystopia than duplicate. On counter Earth, humans sit low on the food chain. The High Evolutionary and his Bestials, a class of humanoid animal hybrids, run the place. Jameson joins the Resistance and Spider-Man chooses to stay, splitting his time between rebel missions and his new life as Peter Parker, renting a room from a doctor named Naoko and bonding with her son Shane. But the symbiotes are here too, part of a larger hive mind known as the Synoptic, and are not finished with Spider-Man yet. The animation leans dark, with lots of shadows, deep blues, and heavy contrast. It's not sleek, but it suits the tone. The action is sharp and the story builds with real continuity, a change from the more episodic feeling of its 90s predecessor. Rino Romano brings a solid voice for Peter, hitting that blend of intelligence, guilt, and reluctant responsibility. There's lots of quiet moments, flashbacks with MJ, and long looks into the sky where the loneliness hits harder than expected. American Dad, 2005. American Dad began life in the shadow of its older sibling. Any guesses who we're talking about? Anyone? Well, after Family Guy clawed its way back from cancellation thanks to monster DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns, Fox handed Seth MacFarlane another slot, likely a blank check. What came out of that was more like a retread with a few superficial changes. A dad in a suit instead of a dad in a white shirt, an alien instead of a baby, a talking goldfish instead of a talking dog. It looked familiar because it was familiar. Stan Smith is the centerpiece, a caricature of American exceptionalism with a badge, a chin the size of a toaster, a worldview that makes Archie Bunker seem like a philosopher. He works for the CIA, solves problems with force, and brings that same reckless energy home. His wife Francine, drawn with patience and sangria, exists somewhere between Stepford and Street Gang. The kids hit all the usual notes. We mean Haley rebels, Steve tries too hard, and neither gets much space beyond their assigned quirks. Roger, the alien with a costume addiction and no sense of decency, quickly became the real engine of the show, unhinged, unpredictable, and often the only part that felt original. The early episodes lean into political satire, but pull back quickly. The show never fully commits, unsure whether it wants to punch up or just make fart jokes in an American flag. And while it does find its footing later with weirder, more self-contained episodes, check out Ricky Spanish and trust me on this one, this introduction felt like a warmed-up leftovers plate from Family Guy's fridge. Over time, American Dad would evolve into its own beast, stranger, more experimental, and oddly more resilient than expected. Launch, it coasted on familiarity. Today, it's my personal favorite among Seth MacFarlane's offerings. Extreme Ghostbusters. 1997, Extreme Ghostbusters picked up the proton pack where the real Ghostbusters left off. Egon Spengler stuck around, now older, more reclusive, and still living in the firehouse with Slimer, the only ghost they didn't trap. The rest of the original team has drifted off, paranormal quiet having dried up both their workload and their momentum. But when ghost sightings begin again in New York, Egon turns to a new generation, his college students. The new crew, Kylie, Eduardo, Roland, and Garrett, didn't mimic the old team. They had their own voices, tensions, and baggage. Kylie brought the occult knowledge, Eduardo masked his nerves with sarcasm, Roland played the responsible one, and Garrett, a wheelchair user, rolled headfirst into every mission like he had something to prove. Janine returned to keep things organized, and Slimer stuck around for the comic relief. The tone had shifted. Extreme Ghostbusters leaned darker. The ghosts were more disturbing, the themes were more adult. It wasn't scared to deal with fear, loss, or existential dread, and that made it stand out. The episodes didn't just cycle through Ghosts of the Week. There was a slow-building sense of threat, and when the original team did make a brief return, it didn't overshadow the new group, completed the arc. The problem was scheduling. It aired in daytime blocks aimed at much younger kids despite content that skewed older. Horror-adjacent shows need the right slot, and this one never got it. As a result, it tanked in ratings and got pulled after one season. But what survived was surprisingly strong, smart writing, moody art direction, and characters who felt like they had stakes. It wasn't flawless, but it took the franchise seriously without stripping away the fun. The New Woody Woodpecker Show, 1999. The New Woody Woodpecker Show, although on screen it was called The Woody Woodpecker Show, had a really different kind of energy to it, and it felt like a breath of fresh air. Styled as a revival of Walter Lance's classic character, the show aired on Fox Kids and kept the original formula intact. It was always a few shorts stitched together with familiar faces, only now it came with brighter colors and a new voice cast. Woody was voiced by the incredible Billy West, but the show also expanded its reach with characters like Winnie Woodpecker, Knothead, and Splinter, as well as the ever-frozen Chilly Willy getting their own moments in the spotlight. Woody's character didn't change much. He was still that loud, scheming freeloader with a treehouse he technically didn't own. Of course, he had a thing for turning small problems into gigantic ones. Buzz Buzzard returned as his usual con artist self, someone who was constantly looking for a shortcut to easy money but pretty much failed every time. Mark Hamill gave him the perfect sleazy edge while also voicing Tweaky, a reluctant sidekick who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Wally Walrus was also here to grump things up, and then there was Miss Meanie, the landlady, the rule enforcer, and the one person in the show who could actually out-yell Woody. Unfortunately, with that, we've reached the end of our list, which means this video is coming to an end. Believe me, I'm just as choked up about it as you guys are. However, if there's a show that you feel we should have added or switched in, throw it down in the comments. We're always up for a good debate. As always, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.